Welcome to What's the Deal by Bluegrass Realtors, your go-to source for the latest housing trends, market insights, and industry updates from the heart of the Bluegrass region. Whether you're buying, selling, or just curious about the market, we're here to help keep you informed with all the info you need to make confident real estate decisions. Today, I have a special guest with us. I have Dr. Michael Clark from the University of Kentucky. He is an associate professor of economics, and he's the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research. Dr. Clark is going to be on with us about 4 times a year. He's going to be coming in and talking about economics and the four L's: labor, lumber, land, and lending of real estate that we don't often get with our MLS data. They're also going to be in the future actually processing some of that data for us and giving us the economist view of what our MLS market data looks like each quarter. Don't have that for you today, so we're kind of having more of a high general discussion, but just look for that in the future as we keep going on. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Clark.
Thank you, Richard. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in. So I want to start off with just how do you describe the current state of the U.S. economy?
Well, if I had to pick one word, the word would be uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with the current economy. There's been a lot of volatility, a lot of policy changes, but when we really, I go back to earlier in the year and I think about where we were at the beginning of 2025, the expectation was that the economy would really begin to slow this year. We had a lot of really strong growth over the last couple of years as we were coming out of the pandemic, but we've been seeing that growth slow a bit. And we were really expecting that in 2025, we'd see that kind of get to the point where the Federal Reserve was less concerned about inflation. Employment had slowed to the point where we didn't have a lot of that inflationary pressure. So that's kind of what we were expecting going into 2025. And so far, the economy has actually held up pretty well. We're still seeing some good job numbers. GDP was actually down last quarter, which is a bit of a concern. GDP is our measure of the value of the things that we produce, the goods that we make and the services that we provide. So I was a little bit concerned that contracted, but again, our employment numbers were actually looking really good. The concern is at this point, we're worried that the economy may be slowing down too much or may be about to slow down too much, given a lot of the uncertainty that we've seen over the last few months.
So like you mentioned GDP there, is that the economic indicator that you watch most closely, or is there something else?
It's one of the main economic indicators that we watch. In terms of the things that we typically watch, what we try to watch for is really the employment. The employment numbers are probably the best measure of how the economy is actually doing. And they come out every month. And so, it gives us a little bit more of a current estimate, whereas GDP, it's a good broad measure. But it also tends to only come out every quarter, and so it's a little bit less timely of an indicator. But really, when we're looking for economic indicators in terms of kind of like what's going on right now, employment is pretty important, and we also tend to look at unemployment insurance claims because we're at this point where we've been seeing employment decline over the last couple of years, and really even over the last couple of months. I'm sorry, not employment declining, but the growth in employment has been slowing. And so the concern is, at what point do we start to see employment weaken so much that we start to see declines in employment? So we watch UI claims to see whether or not workers are losing their jobs, getting separated. And then we watch to see how long people are continuing to file unemployment insurance claims. So if we start to see, there's this uptick in what we call initial claims, then that's an indication that, we maybe had a lot of layoffs or a lot of separations. And if we see those numbers, which we call continued claims, continue to stay high, then it means that workers are having a harder time finding a new job. And so that suggests maybe some weakening in the economy.
That's really interesting. And I think an important point to talk about there when it comes to economics is just, it's not like flash in a pan. Like you're looking at much bigger, broader time ranges where, I don't think anything really ever affects the economy immediately, except maybe COVID, I guess, probably being kind of the example of that.
COVID was a quick one. That's right.
Yeah. But that's the kind of thing it takes to really make a fast impact on economics. So talking about things that are persistent in economics is inflation. So let's drill down and let's get a little more specific about the housing market. So how does inflation affect the housing market right now?
Well, inflation, of course, has been really one of the big headlines in terms of the economy over the last couple of years. And inflation has a number of different effects in the housing market. First, we have the housing inflation itself, the actual cost and how quickly that cost is increasing for the actual price or the cost to build a home. So we have that. But buying a house is only part of of what you're spending your money on. There's also the financing associated with it. So if you're going to borrow money to buy the house, then you've got to think about what is the rate of interest that you're going to pay? What is the mortgage rate going to be? And those mortgage rates are actually partially determined by inflation. So, you think about, okay, well, you're going to borrow money for 15 or 30 years. Somebody's going to lend that to you, and they've got to be thinking about what inflation is going to be during that time period. So they build that into the interest rate. So inflation expectations will tend to affect not only the housing price, but it will affect the mortgage rate for that as well. It also affects it in terms of the things that go into the house. So, not only are you buying a house, but oftentimes you're buying other things that complement that. You're buying appliances, or, you're buying new furniture. So as inflation affects those goods, you're starting to see that your budget is declining, not only because of the higher price of the house, the mortgage, but also the things that you're going to have to put into that house.
Yeah, I bought 2 houses in my life, and both times you realize that buying the house is not that bad. Filling the house is often a lot more expensive. So I can't have a podcast with a bunch of realtors without asking the question of what do you anticipate is going to happen to mortgage rates over the next 6 to 12 months?
That's a really tough question, and it really gets back to the uncertainty. Again, there's just a lot of economic uncertainty right now. And we're really starting to move away from a period where we were mainly concerned about inflation to where we're now also concerned about full employment. The Federal Reserve, of course, is who we normally think about as setting the interest rates. And the Federal Reserve has what we call that dual mandate. They're supposed to help the economy maintain stable prices, which they define as being inflation rates of about 2%. So prices are increasing, but they're not increasing very quickly and at a fairly steady pace. So we kind of always understand it's going to be about 2%. We're still above that. But remember, a couple of years ago, we were at 9% inflation rates. So we've made some significant progress in terms of inflation, but they're still not down to that 2% goal that they have. Now, the other priority that they have is that full employment. And that's where we're starting to see some concern is we are seeing employment decline. We're starting to see that maybe the risk of a recession may be increasing. I don't think we're necessarily likely to have a recession, but the risk of a recession may be increasing. And so the Federal Reserve is starting to get a little bit more concerned about that other part of their dual mandate, maintaining full employment. So I think they're starting to transition more to hey, look, maybe what we need to do is actually start lowering interest rates. They actually started this back in the fall, but then paused it because they started seeing concerns that there may be some additional inflationary pressure. I think it's very likely that over the course of this year, we might start to see them easing interest rates a bit towards the latter half or maybe the latter quarter of 2025. But also keep in mind what the Federal Reserve is doing is it's setting a short-term interest rate, the federal funds rate. That's an overnight loan. And mortgages aren't overnight loans.
No.
Not any that I'm aware of anyway. They're 15, 30-year loans. And they will certainly react to that. But that's not the only thing that's going to affect mortgage rates. So when we think about mortgage rates, not only do we need to think about what the Federal Reserve is doing, but we need to think about what's happening in terms of the lending market in general. And one of the things that we like to look at, or economists like to look at, is 10-year yield on Treasury notes. Because it tends to track fairly well with mortgage rates. And we've actually been seeing those rates come up a little bit. Part of the reason is, we're starting to see a lot of money that have been coming in from foreign governments is not coming in to buy the Treasury notes. So the yield on those are going up because the price is going down. But also there's a lot of fiscal uncertainty now, and I think that's causing borrowing costs for the government to go up. So as borrowing costs for the 10-year yield or for the 10-year Treasury goes up, then we'll tend to see higher mortgage rates as well. So we might see the Federal Reserve start to lower interest rates, but we have some other issues going on in the market that may be keeping those rates from coming down as quickly as we might like.
Yeah, I see a lot of realtors every time the Fed either increases or lowers rates, they're always like, "Oh, well, that's going to be a direct correlation to mortgage rates," and that is absolutely not the case, as we've seen since the fall. You
That's
know,
right.
they've been lowering the rates slightly, but mortgage rates have been pretty stubborn, and it's because of these other factors like you're talking about. So that's something that just really wanted to drill in on. You had mentioned a little bit ago about input costs. So lumber, concrete, labor. So what kind of pressures are builders facing right now?
Well, this is one we've been watching quite a bit. And of course, if you've been in this industry, you understood what happened in 21, 22. And lumber prices is the perfect example of this. We thought the economy was shutting down, sawmills started closing down, and turned out demand was actually increasing at a time when supply was decreasing. And so lumber costs just went through the roof. We saw a lot of that basically continue through 2022 and into 2023, but since then we started to see construction costs kind of level out. There's been some movement kind of up and down, but if you look at the last 4 months, we did start to see another increase. About January, we started to see the construction costs start to increase as well, or again. And then since then, it's been kind of flat. In terms of where this seems to be coming from, part of it seems to be lumber. We've been watching lumber prices, and they certainly have fallen since 2023. They kind of came back more in line with what we'd seen prior to the pandemic, but they've been starting to creep up again. We're also seeing prices in terms of metal inputs, copper, steel. Those prices have been going up as well.
So that's interesting. So like it sounds like anytime demand tries to pick up a little bit, there seems like there's maybe still a bottleneck in supply there that makes the prices go up with it. Is that what's happening?
There can be. Certainly there was a bottleneck in terms of the lumber because they basically just shut down production, right? And so when demand goes up, and who would have thought demand for housing would go up during a pandemic, right?
Right.
I mean, the good money was it would go down. So that was certainly a bottleneck. That may be part of the problem that we're seeing here. Part of the issue may be related to tariffs and some of the expectations related to that. Some people trying to order ahead of tariffs. And when they do that, if everybody does that, that means demand has gone up faster than supply. And that means prices could go up as a result. So we may be seeing some kind of an anticipation of what's going to happen in terms of tariffs.
Yeah. And we can't like not talk about tariffs, but kind of one last question before we move on from builders is just like, how do you see economic conditions affecting builder sentiment right now?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the uncertainty is something that the builders are likely to be concerned about. But I think we're also in a situation where there does seem to be, a pretty significant shortage of housing. Prices have been high, and as an economist, what we talk about is, prices are the things that help you correct these shortages. When you have a shortage, demand is high relative to supply, prices tend to go up. When prices go up, that causes builders to look at this and say, "Hey, look, there's an opportunity there to make some money, and so let's start building some more houses." So I think we are in a good situation where, again, in terms of looking to build houses, there is an opportunity there. The economy has generally been pretty good, and the demand is pretty strong. That can of course change, but right now the demand seems to be very strong, and so the prices are there. But there is a lot of risk. Certainly during the pandemic, we saw situations where nobody was expecting the type of price increases that we had. And so contracts became real problematic because if you had bid a job to do some work on a price of lumber that you were observing in the market, but you weren't going to do the work for 6 months and then suddenly the price went up, that becomes a problem. You've got to eat that. And so I think we've maybe figured out how to deal with that a little bit better, but I think that's still probably something that causes builders a lot of concern is, how am I going to get these inputs? What are the costs associated with those inputs going to be? And so, that level of uncertainty, I think, would be problematic.
Yeah, especially when they're, the proverbial, their hand touched the stove recently, right? They don't want to get burned again.
Exactly.
So there's a little bit of gun shy there, it sounds like. Okay, so going back to that big T word that's been in the headlines a lot lately is tariffs. So how are international trade policies and the tariffs affecting the cost structures in home building and renovations?
Well, we actually get a lot of our inputs for housing from other countries. And not only is it inputs, but also the things that go along with the house, such as the appliances. So, the issue in terms of the trade policies, of course, is that the U.S. has been using tariffs in a different way than what we've seen in the past. And so, it's being used maybe as a position of leverage, trying to get concessions from other countries on different types of things. And so it's a little bit difficult to know exactly how this is going to play out. But there has been a lot of uncertainty in terms of what tariffs are going to be. Announcements would be made, sometimes they would be paused, and then new announcements would be made. And so I think what we're seeing in terms of tariffs is there's a lot of uncertainty about what those tariffs are going to be and what that's going to mean in terms of prices. And so I think some people have probably been trying to purchase inputs earlier than what they had anticipated needing to try to maybe stock up and maybe minimize the impact of higher tariffs. But certainly we get a lot of lumber from Canada. We get a lot of steel from Asian countries. We get a lot of appliances from Asian countries. So as those tariffs start to go up, that starts to mean those inputs are going to be more expensive. That is going to go into the cost of building the home and get passed on eventually to the home buyer.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then, you mentioned a lot there, Asia and all these other places we're getting these things from. Do, China's slowdown or Europe's stagnation, do those have any other spillover effects?
They can. For one, we think about who's buying U.S. homes. And of course, mostly it's U.S. residents, but it's also foreign buyers. And so, when those foreign economies tend to slow down, we might see a slowdown in demand there. Given that we have high demand, that may not be a huge issue, but that is a factor. But the other factor is also foreign investment. As we see those economies start to slow down, we're going to see a slowdown in terms of foreign investment in the U.S. And so that can affect our economy as well, and it can actually partially slow down our economy because, again, those investments help build kind of the infrastructure we have that is going to help employ workers and help them pay for their homes.
Wow. It's so interesting how the global economies are all so tied to each other. All right, so let's circle back around to labor. So, what role does labor availability and wage pressures play in construction and housing affordability?
This is huge, and this is really huge right now. We've actually seen construction employment do very well at the national level. And if you look at construction employment in Kentucky, we've done much better than the U.S. in terms of growth. We have had some really strong construction growth, or growth in terms of construction jobs in Kentucky. Now, unfortunately, the data doesn't allow us to see how much of that in Kentucky is residential versus maybe industrial, but we're seeing a lot of construction jobs in Kentucky. And we're seeing construction workers work longer hours than they are nationally. Their wage increases are starting to go up. And that means, we're going to see those costs get passed on in terms of the cost of building the house and selling the house, eventually affecting how much the buyer has to pay. Another issue in terms of labor availability that maybe we need to be thinking about is the issue in terms of immigration. When we think about construction jobs and who fills those jobs, we understand that there's a lot of foreign workers involved in that particular sector. And one of the issues that we've been watching is as the U.S. immigration policy becomes more restrictive, we may see fewer of those workers available. And that means that there'd be, less workers available, higher prices, and therefore, again, higher cost, or it may take longer to get a project actually built. So that's a potential issue. Again, that's not to say that there aren't good reasons for the U.S. to think about what the appropriate immigration policy is. Certainly there are different types of costs associated with immigration, but in terms of how it affects the housing market, well, it's a lot of the labor is supplied by foreign workers. And therefore, if that becomes more restrictive, we can expect higher wages for the fewer workers that we have here.
Yeah, it's funny looking at supply and demand applies on that side of the equation too, right? It's not just goods, it's also in labor.
Absolutely.
Like supply and demand applies everywhere in economics. What about consumer confidence? So, well, like, how might shifting consumer confidence and employment outlooks affect the home buying decisions this year?
Well, consumer confidence has really declined significantly over the past few months. Uh, and when we start thinking about consumer confidence and this decline, what it really means is that people are starting to get a little bit more worried about the state of the economy, what prices are going to be, but also in terms of their employment and their income. Uh, and when we think about the demand for housing, uh, part of that is driven by income. If I don't have the income or if my job's uncertain, I may be less likely to wade into this market. And so this could have a cooling effect in terms of demand for housing. It's just a situation of, if I don't know if I'm going to have the job, can I really commit to that mortgage? And so we may see more people looking for housing more in the rental market, or we may see more households, more families living in a household. So what we might actually see is multi-general households. And so, trying to avoid those higher costs when we have a situation where maybe we're uncertain about our jobs.
Yeah, I remember I don't remember the exact numbers in front of me right now, but the NAR had a multi-generational home buying section in their home buyers and sellers report recently, and it showed that there was a big increase in multi-generational households. So that's been a really interesting thing to keep track of.
Yeah, and there's one thing that I saw here recently out of, I can't remember the organization, but it's one of the centers in Harvard that studies housing. And they were talking about the number of older households that maybe are going to need additional care and not be able to afford it.
Right.
And then what we may see is adult children moving in with their elderly parents to help care for them. So we may see an increase in that, particularly because we have that baby boomer generation that is really starting to reach that age where they might need more assistance.
Yeah, and then the other part of that is that baby boomer generation is living in larger households, and if they wanted to downsize right now, they'd actually be paying more money for less house. So it might actually make sense for the children to just move in with the baby boomer parents. It's going to be an interesting trend to watch for sure.
It is, yeah. Demographics really affects this market as much as any.
Absolutely. And we've been talking about leading indicators here. So housing is usually considered a leading indicator of the economy. So are we seeing any early signs from the housing market about what may lie ahead?
Well, I think what we're seeing, we like to track housing permits because that's an indication to builders that they're getting ready to build, right? I mean, it provides us some insight to what builders are actually thinking. So if we see an increase in builders, in housing permits, that's an indication that they think things are good and they need to get ready to actually start building these houses. And then the other thing we watch is that next step, housing starts.
Right.
They got the permit, but do they actually break ground and start building this house? And so those are two really important leading indicators of what's going on in terms of the market. And if we start to see those slow down, then that starts to tell us, hey, builders are starting to see something that's causing them to maybe be wary and not actually want to start that house and start putting that money into building this house that they may not be able to sell. So far, what we're seeing right now is that I'm talking kind of nationally first, is that we are still seeing increases in housing permits. We're still seeing increases in housing starts. Those numbers are not as high as what they had been during the pandemic and immediately coming out of the pandemic. Again, we kind of had this pause when the pandemic first started. We saw demand was strong for houses, and then we started playing catch up. So we started a lot of houses. And as we started a lot of houses, that meant over the next year or so, maybe we weren't doing as many because we kind of had all these in place. We were trying to finish those up. We've kind of bounced back. We're actually seeing both housing starts and housing permits do seem to be increasing. They're not really showing any weakness at this point. In terms of the number of houses that are under construction, I think we still are building some of those that we had started maybe a year or so ago. So those numbers are still kind of elevated, but those are starting to ease and probably get into what's more of a typical type of pattern, something typical to what we saw prior to the pandemic. All the economic data we have, we've got to put an asterisk besides 2000, 2021, and 2020 is a little iffy too. 2023 was about the closest, and 2024, that's when we started seeing things kind of normalize. But we're still seeing a lot of construction activity, again, both nationally and even here at the state level.
Yeah, I think what realtors would like to hear is that you have this like massive surge of supply coming that's going to help solve the, what was it, 200,000 homes that were short in Kentucky. But I mean, it sounds like it's up, but it's not that up.
It's up about 10% over if you look at the first 4 months of 2025, we're up about 9% over the same first months, 4 first months in 2019. So it's an improvement, but that's not a lot.
Yeah. It's not going to solve the housing gap overnight. That's for sure.
No, but it is progress.
Yeah, absolutely. So along those lines though, so like to what extent is the housing market, how does it help stabilize the economy, or is it more of a drag on broader growth?
Well, I think right now it's probably helping to stabilize the economy because it's doing a number of things, right? I mean, part of it is, it's a major asset for most families. And so it is a source of wealth. It is a source of wealth that generally increases. And so I think it does have a stabilizing effect. And right now, in terms of the housing market, we are seeing that strong demand. We're seeing good employment numbers coming out of the construction market. And so that's really encouraging. When I think about, being a drag and trying to think of what that looks like, I think back to the housing crisis, 2008, 2009, that period, where we had spent several years before that overbuilding. We were probably building more houses than we needed in terms of people's ability to pay for those houses. And then when the reckoning came and we saw demand, partially because of access to funding, dry up, we had more houses than we needed. And following that, the housing market was pretty tough. You didn't see a whole lot of new houses being built. You saw a lot of construction workers leaving construction jobs. And that's pretty hard when you're older and, that's the skill set you have. But we saw a lot of construction workers moving into like manufacturing jobs or finding other types of employment. So that's probably kind of the classic case where the housing market was a drag, but we're nowhere near that situation. Again, right now, demand for housing seems to be very strong. We seem to really be underproducing now in terms of what the market is asking for. And that's part of why we're seeing those higher prices.
Yeah, I think we're at 6 years straight now of month-to-month increases. I mean, it's the demand is definitely there. Yeah, prices are not coming back down anytime soon. So do you anticipate any major policy shifts that could impact supplier demand?
I think let's start maybe at the federal level because I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the economic uncertainty coming from. Again, we mentioned tariffs. Tariffs are a significant issue, and it's still unclear as to how this is going to play out. We've seen some easing in terms of kind of where the U.S. is positioning themselves in terms of some of these tariffs. I think as that starts to resolve itself, as we start to understand, okay, this is where we're going to be in terms of tariffs, then we don't have that uncertainty as much. And so I think as that starts to settle down, that's going to be good for the economy. One way or the other, at least that uncertainty is maybe diminished. And so businesses can start planning, whether they're going to change their supply and how they're going to operate. I think, in terms of immigration, I think this is a policy that's going to be a significant issue in terms of housing supply and demand because of them being a source of construction workers. In terms of monetary policy, again, I think the Federal Reserve is trying to see which of their goals or kind of their objectives are really going to be the most at risk. Do they see inflation as being the biggest concern, or do they see jobs being the biggest concern? I tend to think we're going to get a little bit more clarity on that over the next few months. And I kind of think that they're going to start to see jobs as being a bigger concern, so they might start to signal easing of interest rates.
Right.
I think across the U.S., given the issues we're having in terms of housing supply, there's going to be a lot of discussion about what type of state and local regulations are appropriate in terms of things that might affect the cost of housing. We put in regulations. What is the value of that regulation? What do we gain from that versus what cost do we incur as a result of that? And so I think you might be seeing a lot of kind of state and local level consideration of how they, through regulations, through statutes, how that affects the housing supply. But that's a pretty broad issue. There's lots of, particularly at the local level, there's lots of different issues that they face. So it's a little uncertain as to how that's going to play out. And it's really going to change across different regions very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we get that too, where we're up in Frankfurt and we're on Hill visits and things like that. And policymakers are asking us like, hey, what's the one golden bullet? And like, there isn't one, right? There is no silver bullet to solve the housing affordability problem. It's gotta be, I feel like a little bit of everything. But I don't know. Like, so if you were advising policymakers, what would you suggest they focus on?
Well, I think one, they need to think about what their policy objectives are. Housing affordability is certainly one important objective, but then they also have to think about what are some of the other implications of this. We can achieve housing affordability in a number of different ways, but they may have other types of outcomes that we might be concerned about. One of the big local policy issues that we face in Lexington, of course, is the urban service boundary, and when and how to expand that. That's a very controversial issue. It's been a controversial issue for as long as I can remember. And we don't really advise policymakers on what they should do, but we talk with policymakers about the implications of some of the different policy options that they have. And so when I'm talking with policymakers, I try to get them to really understand, what is your objective? What types of things are you trying to accomplish? Let's think about the different policy options that you have and the implications of all these different policy options you have. If you were to implement this policy, what are some of the good things that would happen? Would this increase housing affordability? What are some of the bad things that might happen as a result of that? Does that mean we have denser housing, that we have increased infrastructure cost? Does that mean we lose some of the green spaces? Think about what that means in terms of, that's a lot, those things are losses. So what do those losses actually mean for individuals? And make informed decisions about the policy. So understand the different trade-offs that you're undertaking as a result of these policies. So not so much an issue of you should do this, but evaluate the policies and understand what's going to happen if you make these choices.
Man, that is so true about so many different things, just kind of in leadership in general, like even decisions we're making here at the association level, like there's often not a single clear answer. You have to look at the different trade-offs. You have to look at the pros and cons and what other, downstream effects are going to happen. I had a volunteer at a former association her nickname was Unintended Consequences, because that every single discussion we had, that was always her question is, hey, what are our unintended consequences here? And that's the kind of thing we all have to look at in all the decisions we make every single day. So thanks again, Dr. Clark, for being with us today. I think we're about time to wrap up here. So everybody, thanks for listening to this edition of the What's the Deal podcast. Again, keep your ear out for Dr. Clark in the future as they bring back more of our MLS data. The next time we have him on is going to be right after the end of the second quarter, and they'll be back with, they're going to take our MLS data. The Center of Economic Development and Research is actually going to analyze that data and then bring it back and give their view of what's going on and tie it in with some of the questions we talked about here. So thanks for listening and have a great day.
Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of What's the Deal? We'll see you next time for more tips and updates from your trusted real estate source. Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an update, and catch us on social media on all the major platforms. If you have any real estate questions, feel free to reach out, and thanks for listening.